Well, good morning. Welcome to the Elliott School of International Affairs at the George Washington University, and to a book launch titled The End of Growth and the Return of Ideology, Economic Sustainability and Technology in Xi Jinping's China, with the author of the book, Professor Scott Moore from the University of Pennsylvania. My name is Steve Saranovic. I'm a professor in the economics department here at GW, and I'm the director of the Institute for International Economic Policy, or IIEP, as we like to call it. I'm also the director of the university's Global Bachelor's Program, an exciting study abroad program for undergraduate students. I'm delighted to welcome you to the first in a series of events we will hold this academic year on China's economic development and the U.S.-China economic relationship. If you're interested in this event, stay tuned for more on this issue coming your way, including an event right here in this room this afternoon from 12:30 till 5 on the CCP's 20th Party Congress and China's road ahead. In a moment, I'll turn the podium over, but I do want to take a few minutes to thank IIEP and the executive circle of supporters for helping make today's event possible. To our IIEP staff and for their support for this event, including Kyle Renner, our institute manager, who directs all of the background activity, and to Barbara Stallings, who is moderating today's discussion and helped plan this event. For those of you who don't know us, IIEP is located here at the Elliott School, and we are a cross-school interdisciplinary research center. Our objective is to serve as a catalyst for high-quality research on policy issues surrounding economic globalization, which we interpret to include international trade, international finance, development economics, poverty studies, climate change, and economic policy more broadly. We've also had quite a focus on both China's economy and India's economy during the past few years, running major conferences on those issues. During the last 2 years, we've also held over 175 events, and we have a number of upcoming events, which I will not mention now, but you can find on our website at iiep.gwu.edu. There are also recordings of all of our older events, can be found on our YouTube channel at IIEPGW. So without further ado, let me pass the mic over to my colleague, Barbara Stallings, who will introduce the speakers today. Thank you.
Morning. Thank you, Steve. Thank you all for coming, both here in person and online. Today, we have a special treat ahead of us. The topic of technology and its links to US-China relations and more broadly is of major interest to the policy community on both sides of the Pacific. Who is going to innovate in new technological fields? Who is going to produce the relevant products, from solar panels to electric vehicles to artificial intelligence and robots? How is all of this going to affect the world economy and world society? Despite the importance that policymakers attribute to the subject of technology, academics have lagged behind. In general, this is not a major subject in the economics or the political science or the international relations literature. But our two speakers today are important exceptions, and we're lucky to have them here with us to help bring us up to speed. We'll begin with a presentation by Scott Moore on his new book from Oxford University Press entitled China's Next Act: How Sustainability and Technology Are Reshaping China's Rise and the World's Future. Nothing less. In it, he brings together environmental issues and technology with a focus on China, looks at topics including public health, climate change, human capital and knowledge production, information security, the need for norms. Scott is director of China programs and strategic initiatives at the University of Pennsylvania, where he also teaches political science. He holds a PhD from Oxford University, where he was a Rhodes Scholar, and a BA from Princeton. Before going to Penn, Scott worked at the World Bank and the State Department. In his State Department stint, he worked on, among other things, the Paris Agreement. After Scott's presentation, we'll hear some comments from John Helveston, assistant professor in GW's School of Engineering and Applied Science. John has a BA in engineering from Virginia Tech and a PhD in engineering and public policy from Carnegie Mellon. His work involves studying the factors that shape technological change, with a particular focus on transitioning to a more sustainable and energy-saving technology. He's explored these themes in the context of China's electric vehicle industry. So as you can see, the interests of our two speakers are very complementary, and I look forward to a very interesting session. Scott, all yours.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Stallings, IIEP, Professor Helveston, for joining me today. I'm really looking forward to our conversation, and I'm particularly thrilled because this is actually my first visit to GW, although I feel like I've been here many times before because I walked by this building and through campus almost every day when I was at the World Bank, and then before that at the State Department. In fact, I seem to recall the Elliott School used to have an advertisement, I don't know if they still did, that was literally just a map of where the Elliott School is in relation to the State Department, the World Bank, the IMF, the White House, etc. Pretty effective because it's very true. And really thrilled to have this opportunity to engage with you all. I'm guessing based on that advertisement that there's a strong interest in policy implications, and we'll certainly try to get into that today. So I'm a big fan of bottom lines up front. So here it is with respect to China's next act. We have to rethink China's role in the world, as well as our interpretation of China's development trajectory, principally in terms of two areas. One is sustainability, and the other is emerging technology. And we also have to think about how to tackle shared challenges, global challenges in both of those areas, not just through cooperation, as we commonly and conventionally think of it, but also through economic and geopolitical competition. And I'll, of course, say more about all of those things. Having given the nutshell up front, though, I hope that you'll be interested in learning a little bit more about the book as well, and invite you to take a look at the links you can see on this slide and subsequent slides. Oh, sorry. So I'm also a big fan of explaining why I wanted to write this book, why I thought that the world might need another book about China. Goodness knows there are quite a few already. And it really relates to personal experience that I had, and Professor Stallings kindly mentioned this as part of the introduction, an experience that I had working at the US Department of State with a portfolio called Environment, Science, Technology, and Health on the China desk, which is the office that handles US-China relations. And that was an opportunity I had coming out of doing graduate school and a postdoc. And as all of you will know, being at a university, having come out of graduate school where the whole point is relentless specialization and showing up and being told, okay, you're going to deal with environment, science, technology, and health. My first thought was that that was somewhere between laughable and downright dangerous. To expect one single person to kind of keep track of all of those many highly varied and highly technical issue areas. Quickly discovered, though, and this is a quick segue to any of you who may be interested in pursuing diplomatic careers, that at the State Department, that's by far the most specialized and highly technical issue area that there is. But over the course of my time there, I grew really interested in thinking about this set of responsibilities, environment, science, technology, and health, as a coherent set of issues, at least when it comes to China. And in particular, because during the time that I was there, which was towards the end of the second Obama administration, 2015, 2016, those issues became increasingly central to the US-China relationship as a whole. And the best example of that was my work on the Paris Agreement, and that's where this photo was taken. I'll get to that more in just a second. But US-China diplomatic activity played a really, really fundamental and critical role in the eventual success of the Paris Agreement. And that's really why I was there and sent by the State Department, was simply because there was so much activity going on between the US and Chinese teams bilaterally that the China desk needed to keep track of it all. And my job was literally just to keep track of all of the activity that was going on. This photo, by the way, was taken in the sort of US delegation office during the Paris Agreement. I'm there in the center with my hand on a newspaper there. The tall gentleman that you can see there is then Secretary of State John Kerry, with his hand sort of a little awkwardly on my shoulder. And the backstory here, which I probably shouldn't confess, but nonetheless is pretty amusing, so I will, is that I was reading that newspaper that you see there, trying to keep appraised of the day's events. Secretary Kerry walked in, which was not that typical, at least that early in the morning, and it was pretty early in the morning at the time. He came right over to me, said something to the effect of, I thought you guys were all supposed to be working, which accounts for the kind of nervous laughter that you see in the background of the photo too. I hasten to add that although climate change was probably the best example of how environment, science, technology, health issues became so central to the US-China relationship, there were others, and this was a time just sort of coming off of what was viewed as a really successful example of US-China cooperation in response to a very serious Ebola outbreak in West Africa. It's now almost entirely forgotten, but if you go back to 2014, 2015, it was actually a pretty significant political issue. And it was a major priority for the Obama administration. Actually, the now White House Chief of Staff, Ron Klain, arguably sort of earned his spurs dealing with this Ebola outbreak at the time. So it's a very serious issue. And the fact that US-China cooperation was pretty successful in helping to address it and prevent its spread much outside of West Africa was a pretty dramatic sign of something that I believed at the time, and a lot of other people did, which was that not only were the United States and China capable of working together to address these shared global challenges like public health and like climate change, but that doing so could lay the foundation for a more constructive relationship going forward. Well, we all know how that turned out over the last decade. And over that time, I've been thinking a lot about how and why that vision that I had and that I think many others shared failed and frankly failed pretty spectacularly. And of course, what might replace that vision, given that these shared global challenges, whether we're talking about pandemic prevention or climate protection, have of course only grown more severe in the time since. Just to kind of give a little bit more of a conceptual overview of the book, I talk about these two sets of issues, sustainability and emerging technology, as a coherent set of issues. And I think that's important for several reasons that we can go into, but not least of which the development of emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, biotechnology is actually changing how these shared global challenges play out and creating some interesting new solutions to them. But suffice to say for now that I think there are important conceptual reasons why it's important and valuable and useful to think about them as a coherent set of issues, at least when it comes to China. I also think it's important to think about those two sets of issues, not just in terms of cooperation. And in the past, certainly we have thought of these shared global challenges, mostly in terms of things that require cooperation, but also in terms of competition. And this is a word that you very often hear follow mention of the word China, especially here in Washington, and yet very few people define what they mean. And one thing that I think is important to do and that I try to do in the book is to put forward a definition of what we mean when we talk about competition with China, whether it's economic, geopolitical, or ideological. And I think competition means a mode of interaction, whether it's trade or communication or diplomatic dialogue or exchange, that is conducted in the belief that both sides will gain from that interaction. In other words, that there will be gains to both sides. But the aim is fundamentally to ensure that one side, presumably your side, gains more than the other. And that's different from cooperation, which is also a mode of interaction where you're engaging, trading, communicating on the basis of expecting gains to arise from that interaction, but you expect those gains to be shared relatively equitably. And that there's something about the expectation that this interaction is good for its own sake. You're not doing it necessarily to improve your position vis-a-vis another party. It's a non-zero-sum game, so to speak, as opposed to a zero-sum one. And I think that's an important conceptual difference, especially when we think about using it as a response to shared challenges. So my claim is not that we can have sort of a decoupled or atomistic world order in which the United States and China don't talk to each other, don't trade with one another, don't interact with one another. What I am saying is that there are ways to advance action on shared global challenges and regulating emerging technologies through competition, through this mode of interaction in which this engagement and interaction is intended to advance the interests of one side over another, and that can still be beneficial in many ways for the planet. And just to say that the book really tries to focus on the interaction of these four or of these two issue areas and these two modes of interaction, which I think are all really important elements of understanding China's role in the world generally, and specifically with respect to sustainability and technology. One other point I want to make now is that thinking about these competition versus cooperation, there's a third mode of interaction, which is conflict. And that's the most destructive form of interaction, not one that I think there is much, if any, potential to advance shared action on shared global challenges through. And part of the appeal or logic of competition is to avoid conflict. I think that's an important caveat to keep in mind as we think about the state of particularly U.S.-China relations, which is something I'm sure we'll want to talk a little bit more about. I'm just going to briefly outline that there's a theoretical framework that I draw on in the book. And I'm mentioning this because this is an academic audience, although the book isn't kind of necessarily intended as a deep scholarly investigation. But there's a concept called the risk society that I think usefully ties together these issues of sustainability and emerging technologies that I draw on in the book. It was a concept developed principally by a German sociologist named Ulrich Beck. And he came up with this concept that at a certain point in the process of development and modernization, societies become dominated by fears and concerns of existential risks. Beck was writing in the late 1980s, early 1990s, at a time in which the threat of nuclear war was very prevalent, as well as the other kind of issue that he talks about in relation to existential risk is the proliferation of invisible carcinogenic chemicals throughout the environment. And the point of the risk society framework is to say that these risks tend to proliferate and permeate society, politics, and they have a very corrosive effect because they're very difficult for governments and societies and communities to address using conventional means. They require a broad rethinking of how to tackle shared challenges. In the meantime, they create a lot of mistrust, a lot of social and political tension. And I think that's a useful framework to keep in mind when we think about some key developments that have taken place in China over just the last few years. The effect of COVID-19 is probably the best example. Obviously, the pandemic disrupted life everywhere. We all know that from our personal lives, but arguably nowhere as significantly and severely as in the case of China, which of course has been subject to mass lockdowns on the mega city, mega region scale, and has seen the proliferation of tracking apps and other surveillance technologies that have really fundamentally transformed everyday life, the economy, how citizens relate to the state, and on and on. And I think it's a pretty vivid example of how a response to a risk, and in the case of COVID-19, incidentally, one that closely mirrors Beck's original understanding of what causes these existential risks, something that's invisible, very difficult to kind of comprehend, track, identify, has utterly transformed life in contemporary China. But climate change is another, and certainly one that has had accelerating effects in China for some time. The photo here is a picture of the Zhengzhou subway taken during the summer of 2021. And that was the second consecutive summer in which China experienced record-breaking flooding. Sadly, 15 people died in this incident. 500 people were trapped underground. But I could just as easily have included a slide or a photo from this past summer when China was subject not to record-breaking flooding. And I should perhaps add that given the duration of pretty accurate flood records in China, record-breaking is really saying something. The world's most severe heat wave on record, both in terms of its intensity, its duration, and the number of people affected. And in fact, one of the things that I came to believe while researching and writing this book is that of the world's large economies, China may be the single most heavily exposed to climate risks. That's perhaps something we can come back to. But needless to say, an area in which the prevalence of ecological risk and the extent to which that has had major impacts and effects on China's development trajectory is something that's become vividly apparent just in the last few years. Yet it's not just ecological risk that's come to define much of contemporary life in China. Sorry about that. Had a little microphone failure, I think. But also technological risk. And the best example of that is the gentleman in this photo here. His name is He Jiankui. And I'm curious, does anyone recognize that name or know who he is? In the talks that I've given so far, only one person has. So you shouldn't feel bad if you don't recognize his photo or his name. But I always think it's interesting to ask because arguably He has had a greater impact on humanity than any single individual who has lived at any point probably in the last 400 or 500 years. Let me explain. This photo was taken in 2018 at a major genetics conference in Hong Kong. And this is essentially, this photo is essentially the very moment that He took the stage and announced to a stunned international scientific community that a few months before, he had deliberately edited the genomes of 2 human fetuses in, in utero, who were then subsequently brought to term, making them, as far as anyone knows, the first deliberately genetically engineered human beings. A pretty profound thing, scientifically, ethically, and otherwise. And yet far from being a transformational advance for China, far from powering China's biotechnology sector, which incidentally, and something I talk a lot about in the book, has been a huge focus of state investment for some time. This proved to be an utter disaster for China, politically, scientifically, technologically, and otherwise. This step that He took was done essentially without any regard to research protocols, which made it a major ethical violation, but also made the data and information generated from this experiment more or less useless from a scientific perspective. And incidentally, it's still not entirely clear what happened to the 2 twins that were born in terms of what exactly the effect of this work was on their medical condition. Another disaster, and in the end, He was actually imprisoned. But along the way, China's entire framework for scientific research underwent a wholesale reform. And I think it's an interesting example of how technological risk played a major role in reshaping China's approach to innovation, science, and technology. And an important reminder that for all we hear about China's investments in science, technology, innovation, and China's scientific advancements, it's a source of risk as much as opportunity. Okay, meanwhile, and this is something that I think I'll spend a little bit more time on given the audience, all of this is playing out. The salience of these ecological and technological risks is playing out against the backdrop of a pretty perilous political and economic moment for China. That is true in terms of China's development trajectory, really right at the threshold of transition from middle to high income country status. As you all will know, this is a transition that historically is associated with a lot of macroeconomic challenges. In the case of China, it's exacerbated by things like demography, by things like the prevalence of the state-owned sector in the economy. There are sort of some distinctive features of these macroeconomic challenges, But suffice it to say, it's a challenge that it has proved problematic for many developing economies. And it's worth noting that China faces this moment and this difficult transition from a position of relative weakness from the vantage point of things like per capita gross national income, which I always think it's instructive in the case of China to look both at absolute and relative measures, because very often they'll give you quite different interpretations of where China stands in comparative perspective. And as you all know, China is the world's second largest economy, but on a per capita gross national income basis, China remains relatively poor. And that's important, I think, in framing not only the scale of China's development challenges, but also the political perspective of how China's leaders see this transition from middle to upper income status, and how the sense of vulnerability that shapes that. Another thing that will be very familiar to this audience, but that I think is important to note in this in thinking about China's development transition moment that we're in, is that it's one in which China has, for a variety of reasons, pivoted away from a primary dependence on export-led growth toward other sources of growth, including indigenous innovation. And I should point out that much of this is healthy, desirable, kind of par for the course for many developing economies that have used an export-led model. But it is one that has proven very difficult economically as well as politically. And that brings me to another point, which is that this transition is not just economically challenging and difficult, and not only is it sort of technically and bureaucratically tricky to manage, but it also holds a lot of political peril. Because as an empirical matter, this transition from middle to high income country status has, in the case of many other economies, been associated with some significant degree of political change. I hasten to add that I'm not suggesting that China is going to democratize or even necessarily experience significant political reform. What I do suggest is that this is a transition that tends to place very severe pressures on political systems. And China's leaders are very much aware of that. This graph, by the way, just maps a measure of democratic accountability against GDP per capita. And basically what it shows is that even in countries like Singapore, which are authoritarian states, have experienced a significant increase in measures of democratic accountability as they've moved up the income ladder. And China, is certainly a bit of an outlier on that metric. I also hasten to add that this is 2019 data, so Hong Kong, would look a bit different now after passage of the national security law the year after. What all this adds up to is that China faces these ecological and technological risks from a position of weakness and concern for the political and economic consequences of its future development pathway. And that has produced a really unfortunate response from Beijing's decision makers, which is to rely on three deeply rooted but very problematic, at least from a foreign point of view, impulses and policy approaches. And the three that I talk about in the book are authoritarianism, nationalism, and protectionism. And unfortunately, it's that reliance and the use of those approaches and principles to respond to these newer ecological and technological risks that has unfortunately undermined the prospects for a cooperative response to shared global challenges, whether it's climate change or the regulation of emerging technologies. I hasten to add that my focus in this book is purely on China, but it is, I think, important to acknowledge that China is far from the only country that has experienced a turn toward these illiberal impulses, whether it's protectionism, nationalism, or authoritarianism. And I think explaining the poor outcomes of global cooperative approaches to shared global challenges over the past decade has to take that into account. But I just note that parenthetically, given my focus purely on China in this book. And I would also add that China's reliance on these illiberal practices is especially problematic given the significance of its role in tackling issues like climate change as the world's largest emitter by a good bit, for example. I mentioned that it's essential to think about how to achieve progress on shared challenges through competition as well as cooperation. And I think a good example of that is the COVID-19 pandemic that we all have been experiencing for the past few years. One of the many striking things about the pandemic is that it was caused by the second novel coronavirus that, so far as we know, originated within a couple hundred kilometers of each other in southern China. That's significant because southern China has long been recognized as what epidemiologists refer to as a pandemic hotspot, meaning a region of the world that, for a variety of climatic, ecological, and other reasons, is thought to be more likely than other regions of the world to give rise to highly transmissible new viruses. I hasten to add that there are many pandemic hotspots around the world in many parts of the world. There is one key difference in the case of southern China, though, and that is that it is very, very, very well connected to the rest of the world, both in terms of its transport and communication links, the volume of trade that flows out of and into its ports, and its significance as the locus for one of the world's great diaspora networks. One illustration of this is just looking at passenger numbers, at least pre-pandemic data, showing that two of the world's largest airports are, again, concentrated in southern China. And incidentally, these two airports played a key role, so far as we know, in the initial transmission, both of SARS-CoV-1, which is the coronavirus that causes severe acute respiratory syndrome, and SARS-CoV-2. What this says to me is that, and underlining a kind of key message of the book, is that the world does need China, does need cooperation with China, interaction with China, in order to provide key global public goods like pandemic prevention, which is another way of saying it's very unlikely that we will be able to prevent future pandemics on the scale of COVID-19 without, in some way, China's participation. On the other hand, the response to COVID-19, and particularly the US-China response to COVID-19, is a good illustration of why we can't necessarily count on cooperation to help us achieve that. I mentioned that during my time at the State Department, public health was a reasonably promising area of cooperation. It's worth emphasizing that since the US and China reestablished diplomatic relations in 1979, public health has probably been the single biggest and most substantive area of focus for intergovernmental cooperation. And even specifically on pandemic prevention. It's really striking. If you kind of go back even to the early 90s, there was a specific focus in this cooperation on preventing pandemic outbreaks. Again, we all know how that turned out. And the reason, or a key reason for that, the failure of that cooperation, and something I look at in the book, is politicization of public health on both sides. In the case of China, the attempt at developing substantive intergovernmental cooperation came up against some pretty deep-rooted pathologies of the Chinese political system, things like a tendency to obfuscate or overclassify public health data. Indeed, until recently, epidemiological data was considered a state secret in China, meaning that only very senior officials got access to news of new outbreaks, and the mid-level officials who were really responsible for responding weren't often informed until quite a bit later. So I think, unfortunately, the experience of COVID-19 signals both that the world needs China to provide public goods and to address shared global challenges, but also the perils of counting on cooperation as we commonly and traditionally understand it. So if we have to think about how to tackle those shared global challenges differently and in terms of competition as well as cooperation, what does that look like in practice? And I think climate change actually gives us a little bit of hope that that approach might be good in some ways for the planet. The best example I can come up with of that is the Inflation Reduction Act, which, as most of you will know, represents by far the largest single investment that the United States has made in clean energy deployment and development more generally. And most significantly of all to me, in his message to Congress saying, if you pass this bill, I will sign it, President Biden actually justified the legislation as needed to help the United States compete more effectively with China. I hasten to add, I'm not sure that's the best rationale for an investment in clean energy and technology, but nonetheless, it will be a pretty effective one if, as expected, it does help the United States reduce emissions by a considerable amount over what would have been the case otherwise. I think just sort of zeroing in on clean energy and clean technology for a second, this also kind of gives us a hint of what we can expect from China's actions on climate change. China's kind of signature climate policy commitment to date has been the pledge to decarbonize its economy, at least on a net zero basis, by 2060. And one authoritative projection or estimate of how this could be achieved, which is what you see here from the International Energy Agency, is instructive in showing that while China can probably get much of the way there on the basis of existing technology, there's still a pretty significant chunk is going to have to come from technologies that have either yet to be developed or are not yet commercial. So it's things like hydrogen, in the case of the commercial applicability, carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration, that's the CCUS wedge that you see there, and other fuel shifts. What this kind of adds up to is the kind of takeaway message that if we're going to be able to decarbonize economies by mid to late century, we are going to need continued investment in basic research and development of clean technologies. And that in turn is going to require substantial infusions of money, including and especially from governments. To the extent that competition, as was the case in the Inflation Reduction Act, drives that investment and creates the political will and momentum to release that investment, it can in fact be good for the planet, even if it's not necessarily the best reason to want to pursue climate policies. On the other hand, and switching back to the emerging technology side of the focus of the book, even as there is a need and a value to pursuing action on shared global challenges through competition as well as cooperation, it's clear that we do need cooperation. And in fact, in my view, one of the things I argue in the book is that it's actually, in some ways, even more clear that we need cooperation regarding regulation of emerging technologies than cooperation in response to issues like climate change. And one example of that is the pace, and something I go into in a bit of detail in the book, is the pace of advanced research in biotechnology, including in fields like synthetic biology, gene editing of the sort that He Jiankui engaged in. And this is a practice in a field that's proliferating rapidly around the world and is characterized in sort of distinction from areas like quantum computing, which are very equipment intensive, very expensive, have very high barriers to entry, are actually pretty democratic. It doesn't require a lot of training or much in the way of capital investment to do some pretty innovative and potentially dangerous things in the field of gene editing, for example. The map here shows the number of what's called BSL-4 laboratories around the world, and that's a classification that just means laboratories that are reported as doing work on viruses or other organisms that's thought to require the highest level of security and safety protocols, sort of a proxy for you're doing work that is, at the frontier of science in some ways, and therefore has special risks. And what that shows, what this map shows, is essentially that those risks are proliferating across the world, and especially the developing world. And these are risks that, as a practical matter, will eventually need some form of intergovernmental action and cooperation to address. So even just to emphasize and underscore, even as we rethink progress on shared global challenges in terms of competition, we can't do so thinking that that is going to be a substitute or can take place in the absence of cooperation. And again, I think especially in the case of emerging technologies. A few other aspects I just want to more briefly touch upon in terms of what this framework of competition means as applied to shared global challenges. Well, one aspect of rethinking China's role in the world in terms of sustainability and technology is that many of the harms and bads and risks that we associate with China's rise have actually been improving in many ways within China, while increasingly affecting other countries and populations outside China more acutely. And there are two examples of that I talk about in the book. One is intellectual property theft, incidentally, something that is quite significant in terms of renewable energy production and generation, which we can get into later if that's of interest. But on a lot of measures, including things like how many IP infringement cases foreign firms win in Chinese courts, intellectual property protections are actually improving quite a bit within China, just as incidences of China-linked information theft have increased dramatically around the world. One example that I give in the book, by the way, of why these protections have been improving within China is that as Chinese firms have become more competitive, have expanded beyond China's home market, intellectual property has become more valuable to them. And one way you can see this is in the sharp increase in trademark and copyright filings, for example, by Chinese firms within China. Another example comes from the environmental side of the equation. We're on a lot of metrics, especially things like air pollution that were used to be a major feature of China's development and its political economy. Things have been improving really dramatically, even as a lot of the burden of China's environmental degradation has been shifting abroad, including through major foreign investment programs, most notably the Belt and Road. I should add that China has made a couple of commitments recently to try to reduce the environmental harms associated with the Belt and Road, so I don't mean to minimize that. But nonetheless, at an aggregate measure, and what the graph here shows is just the proportion of China's energy sector foreign investment and sort of where that sits in different parts of the energy sector. And suffice to say that China remains a major driver of investment in fossil fuel infrastructure around the world, even if it's made some important commitments in areas like coal. So again, a lot of the environmental burdens and harms associated with China's rise and development have increasingly been exported to the rest of the world. And I think what that means, by the way, is that trying to address those is really fundamentally a multilateral problem. It's not something you can address through bilateral ties or relationships, as perhaps we once thought was possible and was really the default mode during the time of the Paris Agreement negotiations, for example. Another important characteristic of China's development, and I think it's particularly relevant in thinking about prospects for renewable energy, clean technology development, is that as vast and impressive as China's performance in science, technology, and innovation has been, there's still a pretty significant gap that exists between China and advanced economies. And moreover, there are pretty fundamental reasons to expect that that gap is going to continue for the foreseeable future. A line I use in the book, which I think is helpful here, is that it's not so much that the US or other advanced economies have in any way, material way at least, fallen behind in science, technology, or innovation, so much as China has begun to catch up. And you see that narrowing of the gap in the left-hand panel there, which just maps research and development spending as a percentage of GDP, as a percentage of GDP against GDP per capita. And this measurement, I think, is useful in showing that relative to a lot of other emerging economies, China has really prioritized research and development spending. And it's done so in part because, as I mentioned earlier, innovation is such a key driver of China's macroeconomic development. And the increase in that has been so significant that it's starting to approach US levels. But there nonetheless is a gap, and for reasons we can go into in some detail if it's of interest, that gap is likely to persist into the future. Another way of looking at this, and this is the right-hand panel, is looking at patent applications as sort of a proxy, an imperfect one, admittedly, for innovation outputs. And while China, excuse me, has by far the largest single number of patent applications of any single country in the world. In fact, in 2011, China surpassed the United States for the first time as the country with the largest single number of patent applications. On a per capita basis, it actually compares not all that favorably to other countries, including its own neighbors like Japan and Korea. I hasten to add, neither does the US on this particular metric. And that certainly underscores a point that I make in the book, which is that none of this can be a source of satisfaction to the extent that we're concerned about competing effectively with China. And in fact, it should be a prompt for greater investment in science, technology, and innovation. I just want to touch on one more aspect of the book, because I do think it is really important when it comes to thinking about how to compete effectively. So again, to the extent that we're thinking about relations with China in terms of competition, how does one win economically, geopolitically, or otherwise? And one thing that became very clear to me is that although we often think about competition with China or rivalry with China in terms of big physical things, aircraft carriers, Belt and Road mega projects, actually the most important sources of competitive advantage are intangible things. And it's things like being able to shape norms and standards around emerging technologies in ways that benefit your country's firms, for example. It's having access to significant and diverse sets of data. And above all, it's having access to human capital and talent. And there was one particularly vivid example that I was a little bit familiar with before doing the research for this book, but got into in the course of doing it. And that's the case of Qian Xuesun. And I'm just curious, is anybody familiar with Qian? Probably a few folks will have heard of him, but a very interesting, fascinating, really, guy. So he came to the United States, born in Hangzhou, close to Shanghai, came to the US in the mid-1930s, ended up studying at Caltech, and played a really important role in the formation of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. For any space nerds out there, they're the folks who today build the Mars rovers. But at the time, and as the name implies, they were the center of development of early jet engine technology in the US. Qian was such a singular genius, really, that after the Second World War, when a whole cadre of ex-German scientists and engineers, most famously Wernher von Braun, were captured essentially by the United States, brought back to help start the US space and rocket programs, no native-born American had the proper expertise to question them. So Qian was temporarily made a lieutenant colonel in the US Army just so he could question these ex-German Army officers. And that's the photo that you see here. During the 1950s, though, Qian became suspected of harboring covert communist sympathies, and eventually he was deported back to Mao's China, where he promptly helped to start both China's space and nuclear programs. A US official actually later called that deportation the stupidest thing that this country has ever done. I won't, offer a judgment on that. But I will observe that it's a stunning case of how just a single individual and the skills and talent and ability embodied just in a single individual can almost literally single-handedly change the balance of power between countries. And I think that's a lesson that is really important to bear in mind, frankly, as the United States, China, and other countries appear to be turning inwards, appear to be turning away from the free movement of people, ideas, and other things that I think are really the true source of competitive advantage, even as ironically, they do that in part out of a desire to compete more effectively. Just want to close with a couple of final takeaways and thoughts. First of all, as I alluded to, I think in some ways the conventional wisdom that issues like climate change are all about cooperation, whereas emerging technologies like artificial intelligence are about competition, actually may be slightly backwards, if not exactly backwards, in that there are at least some ways in which competition might be good for public goods like climate protection, but they might be fatal when it comes to the need to regulate emerging technologies. Second, we need much more effective coordination and collaboration between state and non-state actors. I think one other commonality between sustainability and emerging technology is that both of these issue areas define a really critical and important role for non-governmental actors, whether that's private enterprise, universities, research institutions. And in the case of emerging technologies, it's also significant to note that individual researchers or laboratories or biotech startups are often the de facto regulators, deciding, is it a good idea to take this step? Is it a good idea to edit a genome in this way? Is it a good idea to train an AI to do this or that? Oftentimes the de facto regulators are not states, in part because they can't keep up with the progress of technology, but in part because these areas are just developing so fast that it's left to these non-state actors. And so we need much more effective coordination and collaboration. And finally, that when it comes to competing effectively, it's really the intangible things that matter most. I'll close there and really look forward to the rest of our discussion. Thank you.
Here you go. Sure.
Well, thanks.
Oh, sorry. Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Or is that going to be later?
It's later, please.
Okay.
So I don't have any slides. Just going to talk a little bit. So thanks, Scott. I mean, I think Scott laid out a really accurate depiction of where we're at in the world today with China and China's position in the world, and in particular with respect to the US. I pretty much say I would agree with everything he said. So if you're looking for me pushing back on a lot of things, I don't have a whole lot to say on that. I'm going to focus my energy on climate, and that's the single issue that I tend to focus on in my research portfolio as well. I'm heavily focused on the transition to low carbon technologies, electric vehicles, solar panels, wind, nuclear power, and transforming the world's energy systems. So that's where I want to focus, because I see that as still, I think, the probably biggest sort of existential crisis that necessitates the world collectively solving this problem. The other ones are important, disease, obviously, things like this, public health. But climate is the long-term one where if we don't change our current status quo, we're going to be in deep trouble very, very quickly. And the thing I want to emphasize is really just the time frame of this. Time is what I always try to get on the table, that the time we have left to address this is really short. It may not seem like it, and I think that's the challenge. It looks like we have all this time, but by the time I've retired, we basically need to be in negative emission zone. We don't need to be we need to be decreasing taking CO2 out of the atmosphere. So my lifetime, that's it. That's what we got left, or we're going to be in a pretty catastrophic conditions for human life on the planet. So what we need to do, we need to immediately stop using all fossil fuels for electricity generation. That's pretty hard. We need to deploy renewables at a totally breakneck speed, just an insane speed and scale. We need to completely turn over the entire vehicle fleet. Every car that's on the road, we need to move it from gas to electric. And we have about 15 to 20 years to really do that. And that's everywhere in the world. So if you haven't got it yet, it's a really hard problem. Like this is what I'm trying to emphasize. It's just how hard this is to do and how to do it and how hard it is to do it in a short amount of time. So what does this mean for China? Well, 70% of the world's solar panels are made in China. 75% of lithium-ion batteries are made in China. Half the world's electric cars are made in China. almost all of the permanent magnets that go into electric vehicle motors, generators for wind turbines, they're all made in China. And China's probably the only country that's going to be building nuclear power plants maybe in a decade from now. They're doubling their nuclear reactor fleet. So in about a decade, there will probably be nowhere else where you can get a nuclear power plant or knowledge of how to make them. It's going to be heavily concentrated in China. So I think when, what Scott presented this, what seems almost inevitable that we're moving down this path of potentially competing with China in a lot of sectors. I think in this particular sector of especially mature technologies that we already have, the batteries we have, the solar panels, the wind turbines we have, these are already relatively mature. Competing on those fronts, I think, is a mistake for climate. And I think that's the challenge, is to try to find ways to actually coordinate on that. So I'll emphasize, what China has actually brought to the table here. The mass production of these technologies has led to dramatic cost reductions. The cost of a solar panel 10 years ago was $4,000 to $5,000 a kilowatt. It's now $400 to $500 in a decade. Similar for lithium-ion batteries, we went from over $1,000 per kilowatt hour, we're down to 150. So those cost declines, they don't come from the sorts of innovations that lead to next generation technologies. They come from mass production innovations, finding ways to eke out cost every year, little by little, optimizing your plants, making bigger and bigger factories, streamlining your supply chain, and automating things in the factories. You go to these plants, you go to a solar plant in China, it's highly automated. It is a high precision factory. And those sorts of skills are very hard to develop. They won't show up in patents. So if you're looking at patents, that's not where you're going to see that know-how. It's very tacit knowledge, and it's hard to replicate. So I think we're moving in a direction now where it seems like we want to, or at least with some of the provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act and things like this, to try to reshore some of that manufacturing and try to replicate some of those supply chains here. And while I don't necessarily think that's a bad idea, I think we will need all that in the future. We're going to need the capacity alone. Just the scale of things we need to do. We need solar manufacturing here. We need battery plants here. But what we need to do is actually learn from the manufacturers in China who've already mastered some of those processes, as opposed to try to compete with them head to head. And that's my worry, is that in the rush to compete now, which does seem to be the agenda on both fronts. Look, for example, at what's happened in the last month on chips and semiconductors, where we've made some very strong actions to cripple China's ability to make progress in those sectors. Those are all sort of in the name of competition and also national security. But in these sectors, I worry we're going to run out of time if we try to fully replicate those things here. And what I really want and hope for, and sort of the challenge I think we face, is trying to collaborate on those specific areas. Can we find a way to make a carve out on the existing technologies that we already have to mass produce those technologies, whether that's over the next decade, maybe we're mostly buying from Chinese firms and just scaling up our deployment here, and maybe learning from them. Let's go poach the best engineers in those factories and bring them here and give them a visa. I think the example you just said about how important one or two people can be for progress is totally instrumental here. That's the challenges I think we sort of face right now. So I think we've made a lot of actually really amazing progress in terms of climate over the last decade. So I do want to emphasize some of the highlights. The cost reductions have been amazing. The world has benefited heavily from that. Acts like the Inflation Reduction Act are monumental shifts especially for building political will around investing in these technologies. So again, even though that was sort of, I think, largely on the back of we're doing this to compete with China, I still think we're in a better position now that we have acts like that. They're going to spur more investment in that. But I think we need to be really serious and realistic about the time frame aspect. What can we do in the short term? And by short term, I mean like the next 20 years. We need to be rapidly deploying these technologies. We've got firms over in China who are absolute experts at making these products at high quality, at low cost. We need to learn from them. We need to buy their products, deploy them. And at the same time, continue to pour investment in the next generations of technologies. So this is maybe where I'm trying to bring a little more resolution to the discussion around climate. I don't think it's clear cut as computer collaborate in general. I think it's computer collaborate in what areas. If we got a mature technology that's already here now, let's collaborate there. Let's take those technologies. Instead of trying to replicate that entire thing here, let's buy from them, let's trade with them, and let's deploy those technologies in the name of reducing our emissions. And then on the frontier, the next generation of technologies, let's continue to pour investment in those sectors. Without a doubt, the next generation of batteries is probably going to be a solid state battery of some kind. I 100% expect that's going to come from a US entity, whether it's a national lab, a university, a startup company. That's probably where it's going to come from. That's what our innovation ecosystem does very, very well, as opposed to maybe coming from a lab out of China. So maybe on the next generation, we can become the leaders. We can be the leaders in manufacturing that technology. But the time it takes to master the production processes to reach the scales that we need, we simply don't have that much time. So I think that's an added element of challenge. That's all I really want to say, because I'd rather hear questions and have a discussion. I can talk about all sorts of other things, about details of those factories, about jobs and all kinds of other issues, but let's hear your questions. And thank you again for the invitation to speak, Scott. Great talk. Go get his book, and we'll leave it there. Thanks.
I've got a whole list of questions here, but to be fair to all of you, I'm just going to ask one to start us off. So my question to both of you, following. Will the technological developments of the coming years lead to greater or lesser global inequality? Specifically, will technological developments and rivalries affect the developing world, and how? Can they participate in how? I noticed in your map that there were biolabs, 3 of them in Africa, none in Latin America, but 3 in Africa, 3 in India, and one that I wasn't sure if it was Indonesia or not. I'm not an expert on those either.
Singapore.
Okay, forget Singapore. Okay, okay. Anyway, any thoughts about how this might impact the social development of the world?
So great. It's a great question, and I think the short answer is yes. And there are two points that I would make that I talk a little bit about in the book, but probably, frankly, not as much as I should. Which is why I appreciate the question. So one is that, particularly through the lens of thinking about advanced emerging technologies, artificial intelligence, frontier biotechnology, quantum computing, things like that. One of the things that you see is that it's the advanced economies plus China that are really kind of moving out from the most of the rest of the world. And especially from other emerging economies. There are a couple of important exceptions. So India is also an economy that has very significant science, technology, innovation capacity and potential. But just sort of on aggregate measures, it's sort of China and advanced economies are pulling out from the rest of the world for the most part. And that has a lot of consequences for what people variously term the digital divide and kind of related concepts of essentially inequality translated into the technological domain. And I think you will see that be exacerbated by technological developments over time. And it's part of why I think we do need to think very deliberately now about the regulatory framework for things like biotechnology. I think thinking about those distributional aspects, is an important part of that. That equation. I think the other thing that I'll say is when it comes to that regulation of emerging technologies, it's also very apparent that it does have to be a very broad-based effort, especially once you get into areas like data governance. That's a problem that can only be solved by engaging really sort of a critical mass of the world. And that makes it a very complex process. And frankly, one whose success is not guaranteed, but underscores, I think, one thing that is important, which is the future is in my mind, just doubtless multilateral as opposed to bilateral. And that's really a significant change from, when I was at the State Department, where we talked a lot about the G2. And probably always a little bit naive, but there was more substantive reason to think that just through US-China cooperation, you could sort of make more progress for these shared global challenges. And I think the world, for lots of reasons, some of which we've talked about already, inequality is another, has just moved so much that framework is not a promising one.
John, any thoughts?
The thought I'll add is maybe a little tangential to it, but it's more about, I think, who the rest of the world will go to and where the relationships are going to be built. I think there's sort of two key ideas. One is how advanced is your technology, and the other is how affordable is it. And
Yes.
most of the developing world doesn't need the cutting edge tech per se. They need the lowest cost one, and I think this is actually where our State Department really has a lot to think about. What are we offering the developing world? Are we coming to them and saying, here's this great low cost tech? No, we're great at developing the cutting edge technology, but it may not be the most affordable one. And China's kind of the opposite. I mean, they're really good at producing slightly outdated technologies, but at extremely low cost.
Huawei.
And
Huawei.
right. So if you're in a developing country, who are you going to go see as a more immediate partner? It's more likely to be China or a Chinese firm to build your infrastructure systems. And this goes all the way down to like where the frontier of key technologies, like all the discussion right now around chips. I think that the CHIPS Act and all of the big movements recently in trying to sort of hamper China's semiconductor industry have all been in the name of making sure that the US and sort of the rest of the West ecosystem in semiconductors remains at the frontier. But you're talking about incredibly specialized technologies now, like 7 nanometer. These are not needed for a lot of our applications. The chips that are in your cars, they don't need to be that good. They can be 28 nanometer chips. It's fine. So if you're in another country that's just getting off the ground with your auto industry, you're going to probably go buy a Chinese chip that's slightly outdated, and now that's your trading partner. And so in some ways, some of these movements that we've made, they may backfire in terms of our future relationship with other countries around the world. And by the way, that's where all the growth is going to be. That's where markets are going to be. So it's sort of related to the inequality problem, but it's going to be more about who's your partner and who are you aligned with. And I think that's going to shape a lot of the global context.
So that has
in a lot of technology.
That has to do with how developing countries can participate via partners that wouldn't necessarily be the expected ones.
And they may not have a choice either. I mean, it just when it comes to cost, this might be the only option on it.
Let me ask one follow-up question. Those 3 labs in Africa, any lessons? Who are they, and any lessons on how they got to have those labs?
So they're mostly labs that are kind of supported in one way or another by like World Health Organization or other kind of external entities, and they're meant basically to facilitate rapid epidemiological testing and things like that. So they're kind of for the most part
indigenous.
Not
Technology.
right. Yeah, it doesn't necessarily represent indigenous technology per se.
Like I said, I have lots of other questions, but let me leave some space. I cut you off a while ago, so you get first.
Actually, thank you for cutting me off because.
Why don't you say who you are and so that.
Hi, so my name is Soto Rivera. I'm a MIPP candidate here at Elliott. And so my question is regarding Latin America. Just thinking as a very important battleground for influence with both China and the US. So what do you think would be some important recommendations and considerations to achieve a more healthy cooperation with China for countries within Latin America?
Okay, well, maybe I'll start, but I'll be brief because Professor Stallings is the expert on the region, and I have to say I probably of all of the, China and other region sort of equations, I know least about Latin America. But I do think there are a couple of things that I would say. And one thing that I kind of started the book by saying is that China has become so important not only to global issues like climate change, but also every region of the world, that it's intensified this challenge of how to engage Chinese partners, very often from a position of some asymmetry. And so the example I give is that if you're a big multinational company or a major power government, the idea of kind of cooperating with Chinese counterparts on some issues while differing on others and sort of having this competitive dynamic is a familiar one. But now that China's influence has spread so far and wide, and it touches, individual universities, pretty much every country in the world, that challenge has become more acute. And if you're a smaller country, whether in Latin America or elsewhere, it's harder to see how you kind of deal with this asymmetry, between the world's second largest economy. And I think that just involves a couple of things. One is building and strengthening kind of alliances and other partnerships with countries both in the region and more generally. And I think also working through as far as possible multilateral organizations. So, one good example of all of what we're talking about here is 5G, which Professor Stallings, mentioned in the context of Huawei. The key standard setting body in this is the International Telecommunications Union, in which up until very recently, China was able to exert pretty profound influence just through personnel selection, who was in key leadership positions, chairing key committees. And so if you're a smaller country concerned about the rollout of new telecommunications infrastructure, building partnerships to kind of influence organizations like that is, I think, a key strategy.
So John, you actually got into various of these issues when you were talking about what LDCs will do by choice or necessity. Do you have any particular thoughts on Latin America, or do you want to elaborate in any way in ways that might reflect on Latin America, even if you don't know anything about the particulars?
Yeah, I know basically nothing, so I'll be transparent on that front. I would say maybe if anything, I think one of the potential opportunities is to kind of inject itself in the middle. And some of these countries can find a middle position between the China and the US, especially if the countries start moving more and more towards fraught relations. So, one of the things the Inflation Reduction Act put in place for electric vehicles was we have subsidies for electric cars. That's great, but they're tied to these local content requirements. So the batteries have to be made either in the US or in a US ally or North America. And some of the raw materials themselves have to be sourced from one of these places. So the US doesn't really have a lot of any of that right now. And so I can envision a future where Latin American countries find partnerships on both sides, that they become places where we say, we're going to make the batteries here. We're going to employ a ton of people in doing this. We're also going to partner with Chinese mines for getting the raw materials and refining them here. And then we're going to ship those batteries over the borders to the US for their auto industry and find a way to sort of play off that competition and maybe grow in some key as maybe a broker in some way. Because if we don't, otherwise we're just the US and China are just completely at odds in some of these sectors. It's just going to be costly everywhere. So there's maybe an opportunity for something like that. Most of my work's in auto, so I'll go immediately to auto if I don't know anything else about the region.
That's a good example. That's a very good example.
But we have tons of trade in auto with Mexico as an example. That's one of our biggest, not the biggest, in automotive. So it's for the future of transitioning that whole industry, there is an opportunity there for finding a way to play off that competitive nature and say we're going to inject ourselves in the middle here.
I just say a couple of things specifically about Latin America. The number of Latin American countries, if not all of them, are very worried about being caught in the middle between the US on the one hand and China on the other hand. In the US, especially under Trump, but surprisingly, very little change under the Biden administration. have essentially devoted themselves to telling Latin Americans that they should stay away from China and it's a terrible place and don't do it. But nothing to offer, as you were suggesting, nothing on the positive side. So there is the book that I actually participated in that's basically by Latin Americans. The English translation, Active Non-Alignment. So they're trying to figure out what kind of diplomacy and other activities could help them to deal with this situation. The electric auto industry is pretty interesting in this. The Latin American countries, the more advanced Latin American countries, would like to move up from just exporting raw lithium to making batteries. The Chinese firms do not want them to make batteries there. The Chinese firms want them to export raw lithium to China, and they will make the batteries. Thank you very much. So neither side is being terribly helpful. We'll see what happens in the future. Okay,
May I just do a follow-up example?
real quick.
So the US made it really hard to import Chinese solar panels.
Yeah.
And that was a huge problem within Latin America. So I'm originally from Honduras, but I lived in Mexico for 11 years and worked with Congress. And that was a huge drawback on the plan to move to solar, for example, because it was so much more expensive to buy them from the US to buy them from China.
Question right there.
Hi, I'm Sam. I'm from the MA SPS programs in security policy studies, and thank you for a very interesting discussion. I've been coming at this from a much more security-based context, so thank you. The economics of it is interesting. From a UK perspective, we recently in 2020 designated China a long-term systemic competitor, and that's rhetoric that mirrors very much the US approach to China. So when it comes to talking about cooperation and competition with China, there's the risk surely of a security dilemma and both sides spiraling into that conflict phase. And so how do you manage that, considering that if the US thinks, as the UK thinks, that China intends to displace them as a hegemon, which is not acceptable to anyone in Washington or London?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought this up. Not that it's an easy question to answer. Really, fundamentally, like this is the dilemma, because the reality is that relations between China and many, if not even most, other major powers are increasingly shaped by rivalry, rather than something approaching interdependence or cooperation or something in that part of the spectrum. And yet, our future is defined by these shared global challenges. And if you just think about what's the UK's single greatest, security issue, I would venture to say, at least for the moment, it's Ukraine and Russia. And yet part of that equation, a key part of that equation, is energy security, which is very much embedded in these questions of how do we mount an energy transition, navigate an energy transition away from dependence on fossil fuels, principally produced in Russia. So there's the sort of overlay of these shared global challenges and geopolitics and geoeconomics. That's fundamentally the dilemma. If I had the answer to that, listen, I'm sure I'd be, a couple blocks over in the White House or something. But I think what's fair to say is that there's this trend, which I think can't be underestimated, of worsening relations between China and a range of other countries, not just the United States. We're really used to, and especially here in DC for obvious reasons, talking so much about the deterioration in US-China relations, and yet it's arguably even more striking, the deterioration in relations between China and European countries. I've also been tracking, some of the statements coming out of the UK government, but probably the single most striking and frankly, I think chilling statement that I've seen recently came from the head of the BND, Germany's main intelligence agency. And the exact quote was, "Russia is the storm, but China is climate change." This coming from the country in Europe that had historically been the most kind of pro-engagement, certainly under Merkel, a country in Europe. So I think it really, and I mean, not that the head of the intelligence, agency makes government policy. But it's nonetheless, I think, a revealing statement. And again, I think underscores this fundamental challenge. How do we make progress on shared global challenges against the backdrop of geopolitical competition? And I think the answer comes through trying to ensure that things like response to Russian aggression in Ukraine does advance an energy transition, as opposed to forces, increased reliance on fossil fuels. Let me just say one other quick thing, which is another thing that became very clear to me in the course of researching this book. Cooperation is almost always cheaper and easier to achieve than is competition. Competition almost always is more expensive and it's more complex and difficult to pull off. And therefore, you have to have a good reason for pursuing it. I think geopolitics gives us that reason.
Well,
Oh, go ahead, yes. please.
you mentioned, whenever someone mentions security, I just go to energy security because that's what I'm an energy person. So I wanted to, I think it was Politico magazine had like the top 10 most influential people for the green transition, and they listed Putin as like number 2. Because like arguably now the rest of Europe is like, let's go green, like as fast as we can now because of this war, which is obviously that was written to be, just provocative and get a lot of eyeballs, but there's something to that. I want to kind of just kind of think about the difference between industries and countries, that like we can have national competition and problems going on, but within certain industries be very, very tight. So that, the relationship between China and Europe is deteriorating, but in electric vehicles, like they're booming. I mean, European countries are bringing over cattle, like China's big battery manufacturer. They're setting up shop there. They're making batteries, using Chinese batteries, Chinese technology. So certain industries are saying, you know what, you guys can compete, but we need to work and move forward because there's a giant transition, billions of dollars on the line, and we're going electric, and we're going to work with them to do it. So there's certain industries that, despite all the rhetoric and things at the highest levels, the industries are moving forward. And the last thing I'll mention is the energy security point, which Scott just sort of mentioned that. Without a doubt, in my mind, a renewable future is far more secure from an energy security perspective than the one we're on right now. We are heavily dependent on fossil fuels. Russia starts a war in Europe, our prices go through the roof, and we will suffer on that daily as we pay those prices. If we had a bunch of wind and solar and nuclear power and generating all of our own electricity here, no reliance on foreign fuels, we wouldn't feel much of that at all. And that's a far more resilient future. So again, maybe we buy that stuff from China to get there faster, and that makes us more secure. In the meantime, it might look a little contradictory, but that's a perspective that seems to be lost, that I think people don't quite understand just how much risk there is by being dependent on fossil fuels. You're very vulnerable to price swings and global conflicts that are completely out of our control.
Yes.
Thanks. Thanks for excellent talk. I have a question about if you see any evolving trends in the role of the state in high-tech sectors and how that's going to affect the prospect of innovation and the cooperation, especially international cooperation.
That is a great question and a very topical one coming out of the 20th Party Congress. Reading, well, first of all, let me just say, I think for anybody who studies Chinese policy, it kind of quickly becomes clear that contradiction is more a feature than a bug. And if you kind of keep analyzing things in terms of, well, this doesn't make sense in the face of that, you'll never get anywhere. The lens that I think shows that most clearly, though, is innovation as a priority. And this is something that's been a priority for, arguably decades, but certainly over the past 10 years, when in 2013, Li Keqiang said that innovation was the golden key for China's development. In the last Party Congress work report in 2017, Xi Jinping consistently referred to the need for China, to become a more innovative economy. And there are, as I mentioned, very good macroeconomic reasons for that imperative. what's kind of been more interesting is that because as that priority has been stated more and more, it's become a political as well as an economic imperative. And because of tensions with the US and other economies, and increasingly, European ones, it's also become a geopolitical imperative as China has been cut out of a lot of access to foreign technology transfer and investment. And which is emphasized, it's still a very small slice of the total. And Professor Helveston provided some good examples of how there is continued technology transfer and investment. So it's confined, but it's expanding rapidly. And so for all of those reasons, innovation has become, a really critical priority. However, and this is where the contradiction comes in, China's approach to fostering that innovation has been fundamentally state-led. And it's produced some, it's produced results in some senses. But what I think is fair to say overall is that those results have been very inefficient, meaning for the resources that have been invested in innovation, the outcomes have been somewhat underwhelming. You have had the creation of national champions in a lot of fields, including electric vehicles and things like that. But you're not, and Professor Helveston made this point, for the most part, Chinese firms and institutions aren't innovating at the frontier. They're innovating, more on the sort of deployment side and the process innovation space, which is another way of saying that in order to really kind of like use innovation to propel growth and to escape the kind of macroeconomic traps that China is facing, you need to see a lot more of it. And it's not clear that you can do that using this kind of state-led approach. That's an approach that, again, while it has produced some results, has not been very effective, both in China and elsewhere from a kind of macro perspective. I'll also just maybe quickly say that in Xi's work report, there were a lot of mentions, for example, of being more open to foreign talent. So that's, things that you would say, yes, like that would be great. But practically speaking, how are you going to do that with zero COVID policy? That, prevents people from coming for, all but very extended stays, the type of regular research collaborations and conferences that used to take place almost literally can't happen given public health restrictions in place. So that's kind of where contradiction, I think, really comes into play. Final thing that just sort of caught my eye from the work report, China pledged to create a system of national laboratories explicitly modeled on those of the United States. Professor Helveston mentioned that earlier, and I think that's an interesting example of the prioritization, continued prioritization given to innovation, but also where it's unclear if the state, through intensively directing that, can produce the type of innovation that Xi wants to see.
Final thought?
Human capital. We haven't talked, I think, enough about it. I mean, that's again Scott's example of the one person who was so instrumental during the World War II era. I mean, the human capital thing, I think, is still the aspect that's the diamond. That's the central part of getting the real huge breakthroughs in technology. You can trace back any major breakthrough like the internet, GPS, jet engines. These things, they come down to a handful of people who are absolutely brilliant. And when you trace them back, most of them should probably came from somewhere else if it was designed here. Look at the list of Nobel Prize winners. The vast majority of them were not US citizens. They were born somewhere else and then they became US citizens. They came here and studied in the lab somewhere. The ability to attract the top 0.001% brilliant people in the world is undeniably, I think, one of the most critical things to have in terms of having a successful innovation ecosystem that produces breakthrough technologies. That's where I think China's going to have probably its biggest struggle. It can make labs, it can dump in a ton of R&D funding, but does it have the human capital at the frontier? And can it be, as a nation, be a place that attracts those minds to come live there? They tried to do this even through state-sponsored programs. The Palestinian mind, so this has been going on. It's like they understand that this is critical, but even so, it has been very hard to manufacture that. And I think that is one of the big secret sauce elements of why the US has been such a leader in all of these frontiers. And that's something I also want to emphasize, that we don't lose sight of that due to some other, conflict. There's a lot of incredibly brilliant people in China. We should bring all of them here. Like that should be our, if we're not giving visas to people who graduate out of MIT with a PhD in rocket science, what are you doing? This should just come with a green card when you graduate. And if you send them back, so the individuals matter here, and especially under the Trump administration, anyone doing work with China became, fall under scrutiny, especially if we were working in sensitive areas. This was a very dangerous thing in terms of your innovation ecosystem. So let's not lose sight of that. Keep in mind that individual minds matter a lot. I'll leave it there.
Well, and if I may, if you take away one thing from our time together, it's that. Well done.
Okay, we agree on as you finish. Unfortunately, we had run out of time. This could obviously go on for quite a while. Thank you all for coming, and remember that from 12:30 to 5-ish, same room, there will be more China-related post 20th Party Congress discussion this afternoon. So maybe some of these same topics will come up. You want to continue, you can find a way to sneak them in to some of the discussions this afternoon. Thank you very much to both of you. Great presentation and comment.